Hi everybody, welcome back. We are now into week 4 and we are watching Star Trek The Next Generation, the episode A Measure of a Man, which is from season 2 of The Next Generation. What I'm going to do in this video is give you just a teensy weensy bit of the context of this show, especially for anyone who's not familiar with Star Trek. I won't try to explain it to you because I don't think, in the same way as maybe Plato or Lucretius might need a bit of explanation, I don't think it needs that. But I'm going to try to contextualize it a little bit, and then I'll tell you what I'm hoping we can do with the discussions this week. I have also added an optional secondary text this week, which is Gregory Curry's paper, Does Fiction Make Us Less Empathic? And so I will talk a little bit about the contents of that paper as well, just towards the end to round off this week's intro. Okay, so Star Trek, the absolutely bare bones. This is a very influential, culturally iconic American franchise that began in the 1960s with Star Trek's original series. It's created by a guy called Gene Roddenberry. He made this show to represent a kind of development of the tradition of Western movies, which were very popular in the 60s, and just take them to space. And so he makes this kind of utopia in space as the setting for the original Star Trek. What do I mean by calling it a utopia? I mean, it's sort of a little bit like the way that Plato does in Republic. What Star Trek is doing is imagining a kind of ideal, not state anymore, because this is a future where humans have evolved beyond statehood, but an ideal society, a federation of planets. So it's kind of exploring what a world where humans have evolved beyond, things like war and hunger and poverty and things like that would look like. So in that sense, it's a kind of optimistic future that the show depicts. For those of you who are interested in the Plato connections here, as well as depicting utopia, the original series of Star Trek is sometimes thought of as capturing the Platonic idea of the tripartite soul. If you don't know what that is, you don't need to worry about it, but if you have read some Plato before and you know about the tripartite soul, the mapping is supposed to be that Spock is the kind of rational, higher intelligence, McCoy is the appetitive or animalistic or emotional part, and then Captain Kirk represents the spirit of the human. So anyway, those are just for people who are interested. One thing about the 1960s version of Star Trek was that it was radical for its time in a few different ways. One of them was including a woman of color in the main cast and representing a character in a command position on board a starship. That in the 1960s was very surprising and radical. Those of you who were in my Arts 1 class will have already heard me talk about this, but for those of you who were not, there is a really fascinating interview with Nichelle Nichols, who played the woman of color on the bridge of the starship in the original series. Her name is Nichelle Nichols, and she talks about meeting Martin Luther King and being persuaded by him that it was really important for her to do that work. She was thinking of leaving the show. I'll put a link into that, and also I'm going to put a link to a little, I think it's called A Brief History of Star Trek. It's a nice video that gives you a sense of what the show was up to across the I guess 50 years, more than 50 years now that it's existed, and a bit more context. Again, just for those of you who don't already know Star Trek. What happens then is that a series of movies get made, and then in the 1990s, a second TV series gets made, which is what we're looking at. So it's called Star Trek The Next Generation, has new actors, and so actually this is the late 80s into the early 90s. This particular episode is fairly early on, so it's from 1988, in season 2 of this Next Generation show. This particular episode is written by Melinda M. Snodgrass, and we're looking at it for the reason that I hope is fairly obvious when you watch it. It obviously raises philosophical questions, and does that in a format that is not the traditional philosophy article or monograph book that you might read, get out of the library and have to study. It's doing philosophy in a different format, and so actually Star Trek and philosophy have a kind of they have many connections, not just the Plato ones that I've already mentioned. You also find, I don't know if any of you have done some work on personal identity and what it takes for one person to exist through time, but incidents or accidents involving the Star Trek transporter, which is where a human sort of enters the transporter and gets that their particles get dissolved, and they are reconfigured in the new location from matter that exists there. Situations involving transportation in the Star Trek mode are all over the personal identity literature and philosophy. So the question of whether you actually survive when you get in the transporter, or whether you're killed and a copy of you is recreated, is the most obvious one, but there are all sorts of other interesting ones as well. And indeed, more generally, as I mentioned before, philosophy tends to have these interactions and connections with, I mentioned before fantasy, right? Fantasy and fantastical fictions, but the same is true for sci-fi, because of, I guess, some of the reasons are quite obvious, right? That it gets you into realms where you might have to think about unexpected questions, or you might have to confront things that are, relevant to us and our society, but perhaps we're not ready to quite address them in that context yet. So we see them in a different light as something that's going on in space with some aliens, and then suddenly we can see something that it might be good for us to think about in connection with human life and the contemporary world as well. So a bit like fantasy, sci-fi gives us kind of sandboxes to explore ideas and ethical things and metaphysical things, and philosophers tend to go in for that. So it's not surprising that there's a two-way street between things like Star Trek being used by philosophers to write their philosophy, and also philosophical ideas informing the show itself, the plot lines of Star Trek. It's basically just all nerdy stuff. So people who like Dungeons and Dragons and like Star Trek and like philosophy, it's not an uncommon combination of interests. Okay, so this episode, like I said, I'm not going to explain what it's up to. What I'm actually going to do is open a discussion thread, and the sole purpose of that one thread will be for you to list out all of the philosophical questions that you see this episode raising. And there are many, so this is not going to be a short list, I think. Some of them are really obvious, and occupy pretty much the entire episode. Some of them are much subtler and go by fairly quickly. So there's actually a lot to look for there. So that's one thread is literally just going to be an invitation to you to put those questions that you found in onto our agenda. And then people can jump in underneath those questions on those threads and talk about them. So that's going to be one thread. But another thing that I'm going to ask us to do with this episode, because of what this course is looking at, in terms of how we can use literature or fictions or ways of writing, whether that's a traditional novel or a screenplay, to convey philosophical ideas, because that's what we're up to. We're going to think about how successfully the episode does it, or not. So looking for ways that the episode is doing a good job getting philosophy into a screenplay format or into an episode of a TV show format. So look for things where you see that going well. Look for things where you see it going badly. When does the writing look dodgy to you? What doesn't work? When are there things that seem like you're being hammered over the head with it because it's so blatant? And when does it really kind of feel like it's successful? We're interested in both of those. This is a particularly, I think, interesting episode of Star Trek for this purpose, because a lot of people do tend to regard it as their favorite. So it just seems to be a really popular one. So presumably there must be something to be said for it, that there must be something that people are responding to in getting into this episode. But I still think there are plenty of points that we might be able to identify weaknesses and things that could be critiqued in the mode of philosophizing that is done by the episode. Okay, so just a couple of thoughts then to finish us off on that, and then I'll talk about the Greg Curry article. So one of the kinds of weaknesses that people often associate with Star Trek is that sort of blatant after-school special type of effect, where it's really obvious what you're supposed to think, and typically people find that off-putting, right? We don't necessarily want to be told what to think when we're watching a TV show. We might be there to be entertained, perhaps, as Brian McGee and Iris Murdoch, you'll remember, thought that was the point of literature in general, to entertain and perhaps to mystify. And so something that tells us really obviously what we're supposed to think is neither entertaining nor mystifying. And so in their terms, that might be an unsuccessful piece of literature. So that's one kind of flaw that we might try to identify at specific points in this episode. Another kind of question that comes up, and of course this is not the full list of things you might want to talk about, just a starter set, but another kind of question that comes up is how realistic the show is. And of course, no one is doing the kind of space exploration that is depicted there yet. So not realism in that sense, and of course there are no androids like the Data character. So that's not the kind of realism that's intended here, but it's rather, can we find it realistic enough to be believable? We're not supposed to believe it, we're not supposed to think it's true, or that anything exactly like it is true, but if it was completely unrealistic, then it would be hard to kind of imaginatively engage or feel engaged by it. That's the kind of realism that is interesting. And of course, when you are dealing in fantasy or sci-fi or anything where the world is in some respects really different from ours, that's where the realism question kind of gets super complicated, because of course you have to have a certain amount of non-realistic elements. So then what could be realistic in an episode like this? Well, how about the legal structure? And actually I'm going to share with you a link to a video where a lawyer dissects the legal realism of this particular episode of Star Trek. This is an issue that people take seriously. People take their Star Trek seriously, and questions about how realistic it is as well. There's also the question of things like how realistic is the science, and so within sci-fi, people often distinguish between hard sci-fi where the science is pretty accurate and intense and part of the story, and then other looser forms of science fiction where it's obvious that something weird is going on with the science, but it's not really worked out very thoroughly, and the story itself doesn't display engagement with the details of the science that would be involved. So those are legal realism, scientific realism, just two kinds that you might think about. Of course, you could think about things like interpersonal realism as well. If you were in a scenario like this, is that how people would behave? Questions like that. And all of this is kind of contributing to the question of whether the show can do the work it's trying to do in terms of bringing a philosophical issue or a set of philosophical issues into an entertaining, maybe, or a successful anyway, episode of television. Because it has to get that balance right between the lack of realism and the realism to be able to do that work. So that's why we look for those kinds of things. Okay, and remember as well at the back of your mind all the time, part of the point of looking for those kind of things is going to be trying to do the best we can with our own writing later in the course. Okay, so we're looking for things that we might want to avoid or things that we might want to emulate in the writing here. That's enough, I think, for Star Trek: The Next Generation. I have so many things I could tell you about this episode. One of my pet peeves: nobody on television can play poker properly. And you see that in spades at the beginning of this episode. But if any of you are poker players, please try to look past that. The episode gets better, I promise. More realism does appear later. Okay, but let's talk about Gregory Curry and his article about fiction and empathy. And I've put this onto the syllabus because in our previous discussions, that issue came up of whether reading fiction makes us better at empathizing with others in very different circumstances from our own. And I mean, there is a nice intersection here, I think, with the episode of Star Trek that we're watching, where the question of, what to think about this non-human android, and whether we humans can empathize with him, and whether he is himself capable of empathy and similar emotive responses. Those are all obviously swirling in the mix of questions that the episode raises. But here we're taking a bit more of a meta stance and talking about whether fiction itself encourages empathy. And what Curry notices or comments on is the fact that we're very ready to assume it does. But in fact, the evidence for that is questionable. So he breaks down why he thinks the evidence that psychologists tend to cite, empirical evidence now, experimental evidence, the kind of things they tend to cite are actually not very encouraging. Both as regards whether fiction really does make us more empathic, but also whether that's a good thing. So one kind of risk, if it does so, is that it may encourage us to empathize with the wrong people or in ways that are not morally useful anyway. So, I mean, just to take a very extreme example, if you read a very sympathetic and detailed and moving biography of Hitler, and then you came to empathize with him and his life goals, that might not be a great thing. So you can see how this goes. It's not necessarily, empathizing is not necessarily by itself a good thing, says Curry in this article. And so even if fiction does encourage empathy, that's not necessarily a reason to read it. It might be a reason to be really careful about what you read, because you need to direct your empathy in good directions. The other point that he brings up, and he emphasizes this more towards the second half of the paper, and I wanted to mention it because I just think it's a really interesting one independently, is this issue of possible self-licensing. And this is an idea. Self-licensing is a concept that he's borrowing again from empirical psychology. And he's saying, look, what this is basically is where we kind of give ourselves permission, not explicitly, but we somehow feel like we've given ourselves permission to do something questionable or less good than we might otherwise do, by first telling ourselves that we actually are good people in the relevant respect. So like we say, I'm not prejudiced at all, and then we're more likely to make prejudiced decisions on a test. And that's the kind of thing where I've made myself feel good about not being prejudiced, so now I don't have to do that with my actions anymore. I don't have to act in a way that makes me feel good about not being prejudiced. I've already told myself that that's true. That's the like self-licensing effect. And what Curry does is says, well, maybe if fiction makes us feel like we're empathizing with the characters, maybe it'll make us less empathic in real life, because we'll feel nice and empathic because we've done the work already with the fiction. And then we won't feel like we need to prove with our actions how good we are at empathizing with real life people, because we've already made ourselves feel good by empathizing with fictional characters. So that's a worry, potentially, about fiction and empathy, that even interferes with the mechanism that's supposed to bleed out into the real world. And I think in some ways he doesn't make this connection, but I think in some ways what you can see what he's doing here is kind of a piece with worries about violent movies or violent video games creating real world violence or violent attitudes, perhaps. There's a definite step there between the one and the other. And how that step goes is something that really we need empirical psychology and much better exploration, scientific exploration, to tell us about. We can't just hypothesize about that a priori in the armchair and hope to get it right. And I think Curry is trying to essentially do the same thing with the empathy and fiction case as the violence in video games case. And just say, look, that link is actually pretty complicated, and and he's quite skeptical about it. He's not trying to prove that it doesn't happen or that it's a bad thing. He's just trying to give us all these reasons for caution about assuming that it does happen and that it's a good thing. Okay, so that's a very brief summary of the Curry article. So what his work will form the basis for the third discussion thread this week. So there's going to be one where you're just going to list out all the philosophical questions raised by the episode of Star Trek that we're watching, one where we'll talk about what the episode is doing well or badly, considered as a piece of philosophical literature, and then this third one will devote to the Curry paper and the connections or otherwise between fiction and empathy. So, have a good time discussing all of those, and I'm looking forward to getting back into it on Friday for the wrap-up.